Are you planning on having Q&A as a part of your next virtual event? Well, I'm a virtual event producer and I have 3 best practices for you when it comes to thinking about your Q&A and how it works as a part of your larger virtual event. Before we get into it, I'm Logan Clements, freelance event producer, and I want to remind you to like, subscribe, turn on that little notification bell so you get notified every single Monday when I drop new videos. You can head over to loganstrategygroup.com and get my free guide when it comes to the questions that I like to ask virtual event platforms. And my last little shout out would be to head over to wherever you get your podcasts and subscribe to the Better Events podcast. My co-host and I, Mary Davidson, recently started the podcast to share even more tips and tricks when it comes to event planning, and we're inviting other experts and friends of the pod on to do interviews, share their knowledge, and we're very, very excited for this new endeavor. But without further ado, let's get back into talking about Q&A at virtual events. So my first best practice when it comes to using Q&A at your next virtual event would be decide how you want your moderator to get the questions from the audience. And when I say how, that's thinking about, is there a chat box on the platform that you're using? Do you want the moderator to pull the questions directly from the live chat? Or maybe do you want to have someone on your team who vets certain questions and then passes them along to the moderator? But one thing I find with event organizers and even moderators themselves, they sometimes forget to ask that question ahead of the virtual event, and then it tends to just have a little bit of confusion while you're actually live. So knowing how you're going to give the questions to your moderator will help set you up for success and have a smoother Q&A process. Another nuanced question, kind of part of the how, is do you want the audience to be able to see other questions that people have asked? In some platforms like Zoom, they do have the ability in Zoom Webinar, they have a Q&A function. And in there, there's actually a check mark where you can say attendees cannot see the questions that other people ask. And so an example of where this might be helpful is maybe you're doing a product launch and there's some proprietary information, or you think competitors might be there. They might ask you an embarrassing question or something you're not comfortable answering on air. So maybe you decide that you want to uncheck that and make sure that attendees cannot see what other people have asked. Another example is maybe that you're a politician and you're doing a town hall and you'd want to make sure that the questions are ones that you're comfortable with. And so maybe turning off that feature will enable you to have that extra layer of security. On the flip side, if you're hosting an event for an internal company and it's all about transparency and being open, you might want to make sure that other people can see the questions that other people have already asked. That way you don't get repeats. Some platforms have a cool function where audience can upvote questions they like more, and that helps you cater your content to your actual audience. So there's benefits and drawbacks to it, but I've found if you don't intentionally think about it, you'll confuse your audience, or you might just have a rougher experience when you're doing it live. So think about, one, how the questions are going to your moderator, and do you want the audience to be able to see the other questions that are asked? Another little pro tip here with the how you ask your moderator is it can be confusing if you're on a platform that has a chat function and a Q&A function. And so you really want to be intentional of what are the uses for one versus the other. Are you going to accept questions that come in the chat instead of the Q&A section? Or it might benefit you just to turn one of them off. So there's only one bucket and one place where people are asking questions and one place that your moderator or maybe your team is getting the questions before they pass them to the moderator. And my second big best practice is thinking about where you're getting those questions from the audience. Are they written in the chat like we just talked about, or are they verbal? Some platforms like Zoom allow you to unmute participants. In webinar, participants are not on screen. They're not heard, they're not seen, but there is a function where you can unmute and have a person share their question live, or you can have it written down. And I know other platforms that have similar capabilities, like Hopin allows you to even bring a participant on stage. So thinking about that process, do you want the questions written down, or do you want to have the ability for them to answer them live? Another pro tip that I like in there is I use a tool called StreamYard for some of my clients for doing live streams. And this is a tool that you are in StreamYard, and that's what you're broadcasting with, but you can push it to YouTube, you can push it to Facebook, to LinkedIn, to a custom RTMP server, so you can do a custom location, which is pretty cool. But they have the feature where people ask questions on Facebook or YouTube, and you can actually pull that question and throw it on screen, so it's visually seen to the attendees as well as your panelists, and answer the question that way. So that's also kind of a cool feature and some other way to engage with people and show that you're actually listening to your audience. And my last best practice for having Q&A at your virtual event would be to have pre-planned questions. The number of times that I've told people to do this, it's not so much that I want it to feel forced or staged or, inauthentic. It's more that you are preparing yourself that maybe your audience is a little quiet, or they just don't have tons of questions, or they're just letting everything you just said sink in. So coming with some pre-planned questions will just ensure, whether you use them or not, it'll ensure that you have questions to answer during your Q&A period. And if you're sitting there and being like, Logan, I have no idea what questions people would ask me, I think you kind of do just sit there and think about what are some frequently asked questions that you get. And if you're an event host and you're like, well, I can't answer that for my moderators or my panelists, it's a great thing to ask them up front at maybe your tech check or your rehearsal, or have them email you 2-3 questions they'd like to be asked. And then you can always address those in the Q&A section if people aren't able to give you that. And you're always then able to address them during your Q&A if the audience tends to be a little slower with questions. And yeah, those are my 3 best practices when it comes to using Q&A at your next virtual event. If you really think through the how, the where, and this last one I would guess is really kind of the what of your questions by coming with some pre-planned ones, you're really going to be setting yourself up for success and make it feel like you're having an intentional reason for having Q&A, and it's not just a time filler or to be able to say that you did questions. I hope you learned something and can apply it to your next virtual event. I'm Logan Clements, freelance event producer, and this has been another installment of my favorite tips and tricks when it comes to event production and running your own business. I'll talk to you guys again next week. Bye.